What challenges do I see ahead for probation? I suppose the first one will be yet more change. Probation's always changing. There's a lot of uncertainty for staff. And even though this changes for the better, I think it's going to take its toll on staff. I think there's the risk that we're going to see yet another kind of brain drain from the service as people decide that it's not worth the effort of going through constant organisational change and restructures. It's going to be difficult for two organisations to merge different ways of working that have developed over the last 7 years, which is quite a long time actually. Have developed over the years. We've got lots of staff in CRCs who have never worked in public sector probation. There'll be different ways of doing things that they will need to get used to. I think staff moving from CRC into the probation service are going to need a lot of support with that, with orientating themselves into a new public service, which will probably feel quite a lot bigger. People in our research that we've done have said that working in the NPS feels a little bit anonymous, that they get a little bit lost in the civil service. So I think that'll be a real challenge for staff who are moving from CRCs into the probation service. Staff are going to have to cope with working with much more kind of heterogeneous caseloads. People have been used to having caseloads which are made up of only high risk, in inverted commas, offenders, and or slash kind of low medium risk offenders. That poses challenges, and I think in the long term, I think more mixed caseloads will be a really good thing. But there are different skills that one needs to work with those different types of people, however problematic the assessment of risk is, and however dynamic it is, and actually, you could argue it doesn't make sense to make that distinction between low, medium, and high risk. People in CRCs have told us in our research that the people they work with are generally lead quite kind of chaotic lives. There's lots of firefighting, responding to crises, and so on. Whereas people who have in the last few years been under the supervision of the National Probation Service have been perhaps a bit more stable, although they pose much higher risk of harm to others. And so you do need different skills. So there's going to be training needs for people working, coming from the CRCs, but also who are already in the probation service. Workloads, I think, are a significant challenge, and it's been good to see attention being drawn to that by HMI Probation, by the Justice Select Committee. These, they're going to remain for some time. They're going to have a considerable impact on staff in relation to well-being, in relation to the risk of kind of burnout, and so on. In our research, we found that there was a correlation between high caseloads and burnout. Yes, there's a considerable number of new probation officers being recruited and being trained through the PQIP, but it's going to take time for them to kind of come through the system. And when they do become qualified, in the main, they're going to be fairly inexperienced, some of them with just that 15, 18 months experience behind them. They're going to find it harder to cope with the demands of the high workloads, in conjunction with kind of the content of the work, which demands lots of emotional labour from staff, which has really high risk of kind of burnout, depersonalisation, and so on. That's not to say that everybody's going to be inexperienced, because we've got experienced PSOs going through the PQIP process, but in the main. What opportunities do I see for probation? A few. TR was a disaster. I think we can all agree. Unfortunately, the government has, seen sense there. But that's not to say that CRCs were a total disaster. And in my time spent in the last few years, I've spent a lot of time going around CRC offices, talking to probation staff in CRCs. And even though the system was fundamentally flawed, I've seen some really good work going on in CRCs. I think, this is my impression, that CRCs have been really good at least trying to listen more meaningfully to service users. And I want the newly enlarged National Probation Service to make sure that some of this work is carried on. It's not necessarily going to be easy because of the constraints of the civil service, but employing more people with experience of being under probation supervision is an absolute must. And I really hope that the probation service can do this. In general, based on my experience, CRC offices tend to be a bit nicer in terms of the environment. They sometimes come across as a little bit corporate, but at least they're not kind of run down and shabby, which lots of National Probation Service offices can be. And I think that the environment in which probation takes place is overlooked. It's actually really important. I think it sends an important message to staff, and I think it sends a really important message to service users that, we care about you. We care about you enough to paint the walls and make this place look habitable. And I think there's potentially the opportunity for the probation service to hang on to some of those nicer offices. Now, I don't know the ins and outs of estate policy and all that kind of stuff, but it would be nice to see at least. And relatedly, I think the probation service could do much more to be in the community that it serves. In the research we did on community hubs, we saw how probation can be a mechanism for supporting people to make connections with their communities. And so rather than squirreling people away in probation offices, I want to see them kind of working out in the community, in community venues, helping people make those connections that will then be conducive to longer term substantive change in their lives. If I could see one thing achieved, that would probably be much more local accountability. I don't know how feasible this is. The probation service is now an even larger and still centrally driven organisation in the civil service. But if there are ways of introducing systems of governance which give some say to local communities over how probation is run, how it's delivered, what its priorities should be, and how those priorities should be achieved, then I think that would be, a really, really, important development. Probation is subsumed by HMPPS still. If it could break free from the prison service, I think we'd see the potential for much more positive change.